Trespassing charges filed 3 times in 1 year. A structure condemned twice and reopened by no one twice. Windows that keep getting boarded up and keep getting broken back open. A no trespassing sign so old the paint's flaked off the warning itself. Footage that keeps getting posted online and keeps getting taken back down. You think you know Pennsylvania. Covered bridges, Amish countryside. Small towns where the porch lights stay on for anyone who needs them. That's the version on the welcome signs. It's not the version behind the tree line, past the chain link fence nobody's fixed in a decade, where entire buildings have simply been left to rot with everything still inside them. Don't climb the fence. Don't push open the door hanging off one hinge. Don't go in after dark, and honestly, don't go in during the day either. Some of these places are structurally unsound enough to kill you without any help from anything else that might be waiting inside. And the one at number 1 on this list isn't just abandoned. It's a place local police still get called out to, for reasons nobody's ever fully explained on the record. Number 10. The Harrogate Sanatorium. The Harrogate Sanatorium sounds like the kind of place you'd find on a historical registry with a plaque out front and a gift shop selling postcards. And for a while, that's close to what it was. A tuberculosis treatment facility built in 1921, at the height of the sanatorium movement, when isolated, sunlit hillside campuses were considered the best available treatment for a disease with no cure yet in sight. At its peak in the 1930s, Harrogate housed close to 400 patients across 6 connected wings. It stopped operating as a TB facility in the 1950s once antibiotics made the sanatorium model obsolete almost overnight, and spent the following 2 decades as a state-run psychiatric hospital instead, before that closed too in 1974, amid a wave of deinstitutionalization sweeping the entire state system. What's left standing is 6 wings of connected brick, most of the roof intact, most of the windows not. Inside, you'll still find hospital beds bolted to the floor in some rooms. Bolted, specifically, which tells you something about who those rooms were built to hold. Peeling lead paint. Furniture untouched since the state auctioned off what it could and simply walked away from the rest. Trespassers get caught here regularly enough that the county sheriff's office has a specific incident code for it. Most walk away with a fine. A few, over the years, have walked away with far worse. A fall through a rotted floor section on the 3rd wing put one urban explorer in the hospital himself in 2019, and in almost too fitting irony nobody who works that beat finds particularly funny. You'd think a building this exposed to the elements for 50 years would have collapsed by now. It hasn't. It's just waiting. Number 9. Fallow Ridge State Penitentiary. Fallow Ridge sounds almost pastoral. Ridge, fallow field, the kind of name you'd expect on a winery. It was, in fact, a maximum security state penitentiary, built in 1898 using the same radial wing design popularized by facilities built decades earlier, with a central rotunda and cell blocks branching outward like spokes. At its peak population in the 1960s, Fallow Ridge held just over 1,800 inmates in a facility originally designed for 1,100. Overcrowding that state inspectors flagged repeatedly in reports going back to at least 1958. The prison closed in 1988 after a new, modern correctional facility opened 40 miles away, and the state simply stopped funding maintenance on the old site the day the last transport bus pulled out. What makes Fallow Ridge distinct from a typical abandoned building is scale. The central cell block alone runs nearly 600 feet, 4 tiers of cells stacked with catwalks between them, all still standing. All still largely intact structurally even after more than 3 decades of exposure. Walk the main corridor and your footsteps echo in a way that's genuinely disorienting. Sound behaves strangely in a space that size, bouncing back delayed and distorted. Solitary confinement, the whole, as former guards and inmates alike apparently called it in oral histories collected before the facility closed, sits in a separate, lower wing accessible only through a single locked stairwell. That stairwell door has been welded shut since the mid-1990s, according to county records, following at least 2 documented break-ins by people looking to access it specifically. Nobody working for the county today can definitively say why it was welded rather than simply relocked. You'd have questions too. Number 8. The Emberline Amusement Park. Emberline sounds like exactly what it was built to be. A small regional amusement park opened in 1958, riding the post-war boom in family entertainment that saw dozens of similar parks pop up across Pennsylvania and the wider Northeast. At its height in the 1970s, Emberline drew close to 300,000 visitors a season, with a wooden roller coaster that was, for a brief stretch, considered one of the fastest of its kind in the state. Attendance declined steadily through the 1980s as larger, corporate-owned parks with bigger budgets and better marketing pulled visitors away from smaller regional operations. Emberline limped along on a shrinking crowd until a fatal mechanical failure on a different, smaller ride in 1987 triggered a wave of lawsuits and insurance costs the park's owners simply couldn't absorb. It closed for good that winter and never reopened. What's left is unsettling specifically because amusement parks are built to be cheerful, and Decay reads very differently against faded cheerfulness than it does against, say, an old factory. The roller coaster's wooden frame is still standing, badly weathered, several support beams visibly rotted through. A carousel sits under a collapsed pavilion roof, horses still bolted to their poles, paint peeling in long curls. A ticket booth window, glass shattered, still has a hand-painted price list faintly visible. Adult admission. Child admission. Prices that read like a time capsule from an entirely different economy. Local teenagers have used the park as an informal hangout for decades, which means the fencing gets breached constantly no matter how many times the county repairs it. Twice in the last 5 years, fire crews have had to respond to brush fires started inside the park's perimeter. Nobody's ever been charged for either one. Number 7. The Crowvale Coal Breaker. The Crowvale Coal Breaker isn't subtle about what it was. Coal breakers were the towering industrial structures where raw coal got sorted, crushed, and graded before shipping, and Crowvale's, built in 1911, was among the largest of its kind in the region at its peak, processing coal from 3 separate connected mines. The breaker operated continuously until 1959, when the last of the connected mines closed and the structure's specific function became obsolete overnight. Unlike a lot of industrial ruins, a coal breaker this size wasn't easy or cheap to demolish, and the company that owned it simply mothballed the structure rather than pay for its removal. A decision that's left it standing, deteriorating, for well over 6 decades now. Structurally, Crowvale is one of the more dangerous entries on this list, and local authorities will tell you so directly if you ask. The breaker's internal chutes and conveyor systems, all rusted steel, sit suspended several stories above the ground floor, with entire sections of decking missing where the wood has simply rotted away. At least 4 serious fall injuries connected to the site have been documented by County EMS since 2010, and there's reasonable suspicion the real number, counting people who never called for help, is higher. From a distance, at dusk, the breaker's silhouette is genuinely striking, a black industrial skeleton against the sky, visible for miles across the flat valley floor. Up close, it's simply dangerous. Signage warning people away has been replaced by the county at least 6 times. It never lasts. Number 6. The Marlowe Estate. The Marlowe Estate is the odd one out on this list, not industrial, not institutional, but a private residence, and a genuinely grand one. Built in 1902 by a coal and rail fortune family, the estate's main house runs to over 30 rooms across 3 floors, with a carriage house, a greenhouse, and formal gardens that once employed a full-time staff of gardeners just to maintain. The family's fortune declined through the mid-20th century as the industries it was built on contracted, and the last private owner passed away without direct heirs in 1976. What followed was decades of legal limbo, distant relatives contesting the estate, unresolved probate, back taxes accumulating, that left the property essentially frozen, owned on paper, but maintained by no one, for close to 50 years now. Inside, according to the handful of people who've documented it before the county finally secured the property more thoroughly in the last few years, much of the original furniture was still in place well into the 2000s, a genuinely rare situation for a building this exposed, since most abandoned structures get stripped of anything valuable within a few years. Water damage has since destroyed most of what remained. Wallpaper hangs in long, curling sheets. A grand staircase, once the house's centerpiece, has a section of railing missing entirely on the second-floor landing. Nobody's ever confirmed exactly how or when. Local legend, for what it's worth, has attached itself thoroughly to the Marlowe Estate over the decades. The kind of stories that accumulate around any large, empty, once grand building that sits untouched long enough. What's actually documented is narrower, repeated break-ins, at least one confirmed structure fire in the greenhouse wing in 2011, and a property the county still, to this day, hasn't fully resolved the ownership of. Number 5. The Vestry Hollow Orphanage. The Vestry Hollow Orphanage operated from 1889 to 1968, run initially by a religious order before transitioning to state oversight in the 1940s, as funding and staffing models across the sector shifted. At its peak, it housed close to 200 children at a time, in a facility that, by the standards of its era, was considered relatively well-resourced. State inspection records from the facility's final 2 decades tell a less flattering story than its founding intentions might suggest. Documented understaffing. At least one formal investigation into conditions in 1961 that resulted in administrative changes but no closure, and a slow decline in enrollment through the 1960s as foster care and adoption models increasingly replaced institutional care nationwide. The facility closed permanently in 1968. Its remaining residents transferred to other institutions and family placements across the region. The main building still stands, a long 3-story brick structure with a chapel wing attached at one end, its stained glass mostly intact despite everything else around it falling into disrepair. Dormitory rooms upstairs still have the metal bed frames lined up in rows, springs rusted, mattresses long gone. A play yard out back has been reclaimed almost entirely by forest, though a rusted swing set frame is still visible if you know where to look through the overgrowth. This is one of the more frequently visited sites on this list. For reasons that go beyond simple curiosity about abandoned architecture, the specific history here draws a particular kind of attention, and the county has fielded more noise and vandalism complaints about Vestry Hollow than almost anywhere else on this list combined. Whatever you're expecting to feel walking through it, most people who've been there will tell you the reality is quieter and heavier than they anticipated. Number 4. The Drakesmore Steel Works. The Drakesmore Steel Works, at its peak in the 1950s, was one of the larger integrated steel operations in its part of the state. Blast furnaces, rolling mills, a rail spur running directly through the property to move product out at a scale most towns' entire economies depended on. Close to 4,000 people worked there at its height. Like most of Pennsylvania's steel operations, Drakesmore declined through the 1970s and 80s as foreign competition and aging infrastructure made the plant increasingly uncompetitive, closing permanently in 1983. What sets it apart from a lot of smaller industrial ruins on this list is sheer scale. The site covers over 150 acres, with multiple standing structures, some of them 10 stories tall, connected by an elevated network of catwalks and pipe systems that still, remarkably, hold together in places. The blast furnaces themselves are the site's most visually striking feature. Massive brick and steel structures, rusted a deep orange-brown, visible from the interstate that runs past the property. Inside the main mill building, the scale is genuinely disorienting. A single room the length of several football fields, its roof mostly intact, filtering weak gray light down onto rusted machinery still sitting exactly where it was left the day the plant closed. Given the site's size, securing it has been a persistent, losing battle for the property's current owner. An industrial redevelopment company that's held the land for over a decade without meaningfully progressing any redevelopment plan. Fencing covers only the perimeter. Internal access between buildings is essentially uncontrolled. County fire crews have responded to the site at least a dozen times over the past 10 years, for fires ranging from minor to, in one 2016 incident, serious enough to collapse part of a secondary structure's roof. Number 3. The Ashford County Almshouse. Almshouses, sometimes called poorhouses, were a common feature of American county government well into the 20th century. Institutions meant to house the indigent, elderly, and disabled, who had no other means of support. Ashford County's version opened in 1867 and operated, in one form or another, for well over a century, its mission and population shifting considerably as social services evolved around it. By the time it closed in 1974, the Ashford Almshouse had accumulated a documented history that county historians describe carefully, and locals describe considerably less carefully. Multiple state inspections through the early 20th century flagged serious concerns about overcrowding and conditions, particularly in a period before 1920 when record-keeping around resident deaths was, by later standards, remarkably thin. An adjoining cemetery on the property, largely unmarked beyond simple numbered stones, contains an estimated several hundred burials, the county's own estimate. Not a figure anyone's fully verified, since so many of the original records were lost in a fire that damaged the county archive building in 1958. The main almshouse structure still stands, a long 2-story brick building with a distinctly institutional layout, narrow shared rooms, a central dining hall, a separate infirmary wing that was added in the 1920s. Walking through it today, the age of the place is evident in ways more recently abandoned buildings don't quite match. Construction details, hardware, plaster techniques that read as genuinely 19th century rather than mid-20th. The unmarked cemetery adjacent to the property draws its own separate kind of attention, distinct from the building itself, and county officials have specifically discouraged visitation there, citing both the fragile physical condition of the grave markers and a general desire to let the site rest undisturbed. Not everyone respects that. The building's basement level, which reportedly connected to the infirmary wing through a since-collapsed tunnel, remains sealed by county order, a decision made, according to the one county official willing to discuss it on background, for reasons that don't need explaining to anyone who's actually been down there. Number 2. The Oswald Munitions Plant. The Oswald Munitions Plant was built rapidly in 1941. one of dozens of facilities constructed nationwide in the opening years of American involvement in the Second World War to manufacture ordnance at wartime scale. At its peak, it employed close to 6,000 workers, many of them women filling roles vacated by men serving overseas, working around the clock in a facility spread across nearly 300 acres. The plant scaled down sharply after 1945 and closed entirely by 1958, its specialized manufacturing infrastructure obsolete for civilian use and too specific to easily repurpose. What makes Oswald distinct from every other entry on this list, and a genuine ongoing concern rather than simple historical curiosity, is contamination. Munitions manufacturing at this scale left substantial soil and groundwater contamination across the site. Heavy metals, solvents, and in certain documented zones, unexploded ordnance fragments serious enough that the site remains under a formal environmental hazard designation to this day, with specific sections fenced and marked as restricted by federal, not just county, authority. The plant's above-ground structures, dozens of low, reinforced concrete buildings, many partially collapsed, connected by an overgrown network of internal roads, sprawl across the property in a layout that's genuinely disorienting to navigate without a map, assuming you had legitimate reason to be navigating it at all. Vegetation has reclaimed most of the internal roads, but the concrete structures themselves, built to withstand accidental explosions, have proven remarkably resistant to decay compared to the wood and brick structures elsewhere on this list. Federal environmental crews have conducted periodic remediation work at Oswald for decades, an ongoing project with no clearly announced completion date. In the meantime, trespassing here carries consequences well beyond a simple fine, federal restricted site violations, and a genuine, documented physical risk that goes beyond structural collapse. This is not a site where curiosity is worth the actual danger involved, and local authorities are considerably less lenient about enforcement here than at almost anywhere else on this list. Number 1. The Hollowmere State Hospital. Everything on this list has some version of the same story. A place built for a purpose, abandoned when that purpose ended, left to decay in ways that range from merely sad to genuinely dangerous. Hollowmere State Hospital follows that pattern too, right up until it doesn't, and the reason it sits at number 1 has less to do with its architecture than with what's happened there since it closed. Hollowmere opened in 1889 as a state psychiatric facility built on the sprawling Kirkbride plan that was standard for asylums of its era. A massive central administrative building with long, staggered wings extending outward on either side, designed specifically to maximize natural light and airflow to patient wards, a design philosophy that reflected genuinely progressive intentions for its time. At its peak population in the 1950s, Hollowmere housed just over 3,400 patients in a facility whose original architects had designed for roughly half that number. Chronic, severe overcrowding that state records from the period document extensively, alongside a range of treatment practices that, viewed by contemporary standards, are difficult to read about. The hospital began winding down in the 1960s as the broader deinstitutionalization movement swept the country, its population declining steadily through the following decade until final closure in 1984. Unlike most of the other sites on this list, Hollowmere's closure didn't happen because an industry disappeared or a business failed. It closed because the entire model of long-term institutional psychiatric care was, by the 1980s, being actively dismantled at the state and federal level, and a facility this size, this expensive to maintain, simply had nowhere left in the new system. What sets Hollowmere apart, and what's kept it at the center of ongoing local attention for 4 decades now, isn't the scale of the building, though at nearly 700,000 square feet across its main structure and satellite buildings, It's easily the largest single site on this list. It's the fact that Hollowmere has never actually been fully secured, despite the county's repeated efforts, and it's never stopped generating incidents that end up on a police blotter. Between 1984 and today, county records show documented emergency responses to the Hollowmere property, numbering well over 200 separate incidents. Trespassing calls, medical emergencies from falls and structural injuries, at least 3 confirmed structure fires, and, in a detail that distinguishes Hollowmere from every other site on this list, 4 documented missing person cases over the decades in which the individual's last confirmed location was the Hollowmere property itself. 3 of those 4 were eventually resolved, 2 individuals found elsewhere. 1 confirmed deceased from what investigators determined was an accidental fall inside one of the hospital's collapsed stairwells, discovered only after a search conducted nearly 3 weeks after he was reported missing. The 4th case, opened in 1997, remains formally unresolved. The individual, a local man in his 20s last seen by friends near the hospital's perimeter fence late one October evening, has never been located, and the case remains open with the county sheriff's department to this day, occasionally revisited but never closed. Inside, the scale is genuinely difficult to convey without standing in it. Wards stretch on for hundreds of feet, patient rooms lining both sides, most stripped of anything valuable decades ago but structurally still largely intact. The hospital's old records room, when it was still accessible before the county sealed it more thoroughly in 2015, reportedly still held thousands of patient files. Water damaged and scattered, decades of documented human lives reduced to illegible paper on a concrete floor. The hospital's basement level, connecting several of the wings through a tunnel system originally built to move supplies and, at various points in the hospital's history, patients themselves without exposing them to the outside, is now almost entirely flooded in sections. And the sections that aren't flooded are, according to the fire department's own internal guidance, considered too structurally compromised to enter under any circumstances short of an active life safety emergency. The county has attempted, at various points over the past 2 decades, to more fully secure the property, to demolish sections of it, to find a developer willing to take on the liability of redevelopment. All of those efforts have stalled repeatedly, for reasons that range from straightforward, the sheer cost of asbestos and lead remediation across a site this size, to less straightforward, including at least 2 redevelopment deals that fell through in the final stages for reasons neither the county nor the prospective developers involved have ever fully explained publicly. What remains is 700,000 square feet of standing, decaying institutional history, still generating police calls 40 years after its last patient left, still drawing trespassers despite genuinely severe structural hazards, and an active, unresolved missing person case attached to its grounds. Local law enforcement will tell you plainly, if you ask them directly, that Hollowmere is not a place they consider safe to enter under any circumstances, official business or otherwise, and that sentiment alone should tell you everything you need to know before you'd ever consider seeing it for yourself. Don't. Closing from the towering industrial skeleton of a coal breaker that stood black against the sky for over 60 years, to the still unresolved history sitting inside Hollowmere's collapsed wings, these are 10 places that Pennsylvania's landscape has quietly absorbed and never quite let go of. They're not simply old buildings. They're the physical residue of institutions, industries, and decisions that shaped real people's lives, left standing long after anyone intended them to. If this video gave you something to think about, do 3 things for us right now. First, subscribe. We work hard to bring you content that is researched, honest, and important, And channels like this one only keep going with the support of people who want to keep seeing places like these covered honestly. Second, drop a comment and tell us, have you ever come across a place like this, somewhere in your own state, that nobody talks about? We read every comment and we want to hear what you've seen. Third, share this with someone who'd find it genuinely useful. Someone into history, someone who loves a good mystery, or just someone who should know exactly why these places are marked. Do not enter before they ever get curious enough to find out for themselves. We'll see you in the next one.